Now, it might just be the preseason, but the Kraken still have never lost a game in franchise history. What's cracking, everybody? I'm Scott, and welcome to the first ever Kraken Recap and Reaction, or R&R. Now, I'm not sure that I'm going to be doing one of these for every single Kraken game, and certainly not every single one in the preseason, but this was the first ever actual game against another NHL team in Kraken history, so when better to do it? And what a game it was. As the Kraken opened up the preseason by beating the Vancouver Canucks 5-3 over in Spokane. Now, again, granted, this still is just the first game of the preseason, and this definitely wasn't a fully fledged Canucks team, as they are still missing Pettersson and Hughes as they try to figure out how to get those guys signed by the start of the regular season, but still, a win is a win. At least a preseason win anyway. And of course, as with any sport, it's a bit dangerous or maybe more pointless to read too much into a preseason, much less a single preseason game. But if there ever was a preseason that was going to be important, it would be the first one in franchise history, as, again, most of these guys are coming together for the first time and are trying to figure out that chemistry with these new lines, much less figuring out what those lines are going to be. And while, like I said, after the first practice, I would expect to see these lines changing around a fair amount as they try to figure out what's going to stick throughout the preseason and even maybe early on in the regular season, it still is worth mentioning that the lines that they opened up this game with were the same ones that they opened up that first practice with the first forward line of McCann, Schwartz, and Eberle. And they were backed up by that same first-look defensive pairing that we saw in practice of Alexiak and Giordano. But for what it's worth, early on, this first line, especially in the first period, really dominated possession whenever they were on the ice, and got a number of scoring chances, passing the puck pretty well between them. Unfortunately for them though, even though they did manage to create a number of pretty decent chances early on, they weren't able to get anything past Vancouver's young, solid-looking goaltender in Artur Silva. But they also weren't the only line for the Kraken that came out strong in the first period. Another line that stood out early on for the Kraken was the line of Donskoy, Geekie, and Donato, who, even if they weren't necessarily as controlled maybe as that first line was early on anyway, they still were able to connect on some pretty strong-looking passes, and Donskoy especially looked like he was in control of the puck and really able to get around just about anybody he wanted to. But even with some pretty good opportunities of their own, again, Silva kept them off the scoreboard. And that still remained true even after we got our first look at the Kraken's power play, which the first power play was quarterbacked by Giordano, as we kind of expected, and featured the first line, again as expected, but also had the addition of Donato, which we'll get to that a little bit more down the road, as we did get to see this power play quite a bit throughout the course of this game. Unfortunately, however, even after all of that, it was Vancouver who ended up getting on the board first, as Rathbone, coming out of the penalty box from that first penalty, ended up picking up the puck right out of the box, getting on a breakaway, and putting one past the blocker of Grubauer for the first goal for Vancouver, making it 1-0 Canucks. It was a chance from Rathbone that is one that maybe you'd like to see Grubauer come up with, but again, he was put in a pretty tough one-on-one situation, and it was, I think, just the third shot that Vancouver had in the period, so maybe there was still a little bit warming up that needed to be done there. Either way, it was 1-0 Vancouver, and pretty quickly thereafter, Vancouver went on the power play as we got to see the Kraken's penalty kill. And honestly, the penalty kill did pretty well out of the gates, but again, it was another pretty fortunate bounce for the Canucks that saw a shot from Besser go off of Soucy's leg and around Grubauer and into the goal. This one is definitely one that Grubauer didn't really have a chance at, as Soucy was able to get in front of the shot, but again, deflected off of him, took a weird bounce as a puck is liable to do, and found its way into the net to make it 2-0 Vancouver. But even after those quick back-to-back goals and a quick 2-0 for the Canucks, I honestly wasn't all that worried, even outside of the fact that it was a preseason game, because, again, outside of those two pretty fortunate bounces for the Canucks, Again, Seattle have been controlling the game up to this point, and as long as they could keep that up throughout the majority of the rest of the game, there was definitely going to be a good chance that they would be able to come back, which, as we're going to see, they were able to do. And even though the Kraken finished the first period on another power play and then started the second period on the same one, it wasn't until 2.5 minutes into the second period that they finally got on the board with a really nice no-look pass from behind the net by Nathan Bastian to Riley Sheahan, who went off his skate onto the stick and into the net to cut the Canucks lead in half, making it 2-1. And just like that, we have the first ever goal in Seattle Kraken history, at least preseason goal anyway. And of course, as everyone expected, it was again Riley Sheahan who put it in. But as we would come to see throughout pretty much the entire rest of the game, it maybe shouldn't have been too much of a surprise, as that fourth line that the Kraken rolled out for this game in Tanev, Sheahan, and Bastian was certainly one of the best lines, if not the best line performing in the game today. Especially in that second period, they were playing tough in the boards and around the net and creating quite a number of chances, which, of course, again, was rewarded with that first goal. But even though, in spite of that fourth line's very solid play in the second and third periods especially, that would be the only goal they would end up scoring, it still wouldn't take the Kraken too much longer to tie things up, as 8.5 minutes into the second period, once again on the power play, the Kraken did equal things up with Cholowski passing to McCann, who buried it, having the first ever power play goal for the Seattle Kraken. Of course, again, in preseason, we're still going to go through all of these firsts once we hit the regular season, but we're going to have fun with it for this first season. That said, though, thanks to continued sloppy play from the Canucks and a definitely evident emphasis that the refs were putting on having that cross-checking rule a little bit more closely or strictly by the book called, which is something the NHL has said is going to be an emphasis this year. Once again, the Kraken were on the power play 3 minutes later, and this time it was Donato who at first put one off the post and out, but not too much longer, Eberle was able to cross one over to him, and he buried the second chance he got, putting the Kraken up 3-2 with 3 unanswered goals to start out the second period. And while we're on the subject, I did mention earlier that it might have seemed like a bit of a surprise to see Donato as a part of that first power play unit, but it became evident pretty quickly that not only was he a part of that unit, but he even seemed like the main trigger guy for that group, which again, seems like a little bit of a surprise, but we have talked about the fact that Donato does have a particularly strong shot. So if he could be put in positions to utilize it, like for example on a power play, then he could actually find a home there and maybe start producing in a way that he was expected to and that other teams he was on were hoping he would. Regardless, though, of whether or not that ends up happening or this is just something that they were trying in the preseason, it definitely worked for this game. It was also at this point, roughly halfway through the second period, that Grubauer came out and Drieger went in. And unfortunately for Drieger, it didn't take too long until he saw his first shot, and even more unfortunately, that first shot ended up going in, making it 3-3. But it definitely does have to be said that this was not a particularly easy first shot that Drieger faced from Burrows, deflected off the stick of Höglander and in, which even on top of that, this is one that may not have ended up counting in a normal regular season game, as Höglander was definitely on the border of a high stick when he made contact with it and deflected it in. But again, it's preseason and they're not going to get too nitpicky over going to replay and extending things unnecessarily, so again, the game ended up going to 3-3, where it would stay until the end of the second period. But once again, as the third period started, the score did not stay that way for very long, as less than a minute in off of an offensive zone faceoff, Geekie managed to sneak one in to make it 4-3, which already that's not the most conventional way to score a goal, but a goal's a goal, and it was 4-3 Kraken. And in fact, it was so unconventional that after we got to see a replay a little bit later, it became obvious that Geekie really didn't even do much to earn that goal, as it ended up going in off of the Vancouver player who won the faceoff, or in this case, won it as he managed to shovel it backwards and past his own goalie into the net. But again, it's okay that Geekie didn't necessarily conventionally earn that goal, as he did pretty much get credited for a goal by losing a faceoff. Either way, though, after a long third period that was quite a bit more back and forth than the other two were, with Vancouver having a lot more control of the puck than they were able to get in the first two periods against the Kraken, including one pretty extended stay in the Kraken's defensive zone, which saw a number of shots go at Drieger that he was able to stop all of. Once again, the Kraken, towards the end of the third period, found themselves on the power play, and with 5.5 minutes left, this time Geekie made sure to put the puck in the net himself. And it really was a very nice shot too, as he was able to, unassisted, put it over Martin's glove and into the top corner and in to make it 5-3 Kraken. And then again, for the last 5.5 minutes, the Kraken pretty much controlled the majority of the play from there on out, with again that fourth line playing particularly tough and creating a few more chances to make it 6-3, but again obviously coming up short on those. And even once Vancouver pulled their goalie to have that extra man advantage for the last couple of minutes, they really didn't get very many good chances on Drieger, and the Kraken were able to close it out, winning the first game 5-3 over the Vancouver Canucks. But since it was the first preseason game, the action wasn't over just yet, as they did then go into a practice shootout. Obviously, this wouldn't happen in a normal game if you are new to hockey. This was just because it was preseason, they're getting a little bit of extra practice in. A shootout would only happen if the game remained tight after the overtime period in a normal setting. And in that shootout, the Kraken sent out in order Donato at first, which again shows that they are giving him a pretty strong look in this preseason. And honestly, at this point, I'd say he has a pretty good chance to be in the opening day roster. After him came Eberle, Donskoy, Geekie, and then Giordano. And really, the only one of them that had a particularly good chance on Martin was Donskoy, who did actually beat Martin with his first move, but then wasn't quite able to wrap it around his toe and into the open part of the net. And on the other end with Drieger, after 4 stops, somehow the 5th guy for Vancouver in Rathborn, who again was the guy that got that first goal for them, was able to somehow sneak it under the shin of Drieger's pad and into the goal, winning the shootout for Vancouver. But again, it was pretty much just for show, as it really didn't play into the score of the game or outcome of the game in any way. In the end, again, all in all, this was a strong start for the Kraken. Obviously, again, it's still preseason, and for Vancouver, they were definitely giving a lot more younger guys a little bit more of a look than Seattle was, with definitely a lot more experience on the Kraken side than the Canucks side of things, especially with, again, the Canucks missing 2 of their better players and putting young guys in net as well. But again, the Kraken controlled play for the majority of this game by a pretty wide margin. And they showed that they could come back from an early deficit, even after a couple of unlucky bounces found their way into the net. And then they showed that they could play with the lead and continue to remain pretty aggressive even with the lead, without making mistakes to allow Vancouver to get back in the game in the late third period. On the forward end, I think that really that 4th line was probably the one that looked the best, all things considered, at the end of the day. Again, they only got onto the stat sheet the one time, but they certainly were, even with that first line, controlling puck pretty much the entirety of the time they were on the ice. The 4th line, I would say, was definitely the most impressive one. Some other guys that definitely stood out on the forward end were Geekie, who obviously had 2 goals, but even outside of that, looked pretty good when he was out there and creating chances, whether that was passing or other shots on net. Donato, who had a number of shooting chances, and a couple of them that could have gone in, and one that obviously did. And I'll also throw Donskoy in there, as he definitely looked pretty good with the puck and was able to handle it around quite a number of Canucks throughout the course of the game, and made some pretty crazy passes that, even if they didn't necessarily end up in goals, definitely could have and would over the course of a season. On the defensive end, I would say the 2 guys that stood out the most were Giordano and probably Chalowski as the second one. Although that definitely could be because of the amount of time that the Kraken spent on the power play, again with Giordano and Chalowski quarterbacking power play 1 and power play 2 respectively. Either way, though, those are definitely the guys that made the most impact from what I could tell. As far as any disappointments or negatives from this game, again, there really weren't a whole ton. If I really wanted to reach for something, I might say that we really didn't see a whole lot come from the second line, which was Johansson, Yarncroke, and Appleton, but again, they really didn't do anything negative either. They just didn't really create as many opportunities on the offensive end as the other three lines did. And of course, we didn't even see Wenberg or Blackwell, which are definitely two guys that I would still say are more likely than not to end up on the opening day roster, but they didn't play at all in this first game, and if anything, this is definitely a team that you're going to have to earn your way onto, as no one, I would say, is an absolute lock. Well, maybe not no one, but you get what I mean. On the defensive end here, Hayden Fleury did have a couple of bobbles or what looked like maybe miscommunications on passes or something like that. But again, I wouldn't read too much into it. That's all kind of just preseason stuff. It more just stood out because of how much the Kraken were controlling the puck. So a couple of weird looking things here and there was a little bit more obvious than it might otherwise be. Of course, here again on the defensive end, this is definitely a place where we're probably going to see one or two guys end up getting traded out before the start of the season or early on during the season. And the guys we didn't see play tonight would be Vince Dunn, Lauzon, and Borgen. Now, Dunn, I think, is pretty much a lock to be on this team. Lauzon, ultimately, to me, I think it's either him or Susie that probably does end up being one of the guys traded out. And with Borgen, it's hard to say. He did look pretty good in practice when I was able to go to that one on Friday, but either way, I'm sure we'll probably get to see more of him and those other four guys that we didn't see today in the second game on Tuesday against the Oilers in Edmonton. Which, speaking of that game, I am planning to have the first channel stream since the entry and expansion drafts for that game as a watch-along stream. Now, obviously, I can't stream the game either, so you'll have to figure out a way to watch it yourself, but I will at least be doing some sort of watch-along, live commentary, asking any questions, especially for newer fans. If you guys have any questions about what's going on or anything like that, I'll be happy to answer that if you want to stop in for that. So if any of that appeals to you, or you just want to come hang out, I'll see you on Tuesday for the second Kraken game against the Edmonton Oilers. But with that, I think that does pretty much bring us to the end of this one. So if you have made it to this point, as always, thank you very much for watching this first Kraken R&R. If you do have any thoughts, takeaways of your own from this game, or questions about it, again, if you're newer to the sport, do feel free to leave those down in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to get to them as quickly as I can. Otherwise, stay safe out there, and go Kraken.